It's hard to believe that we're almost 4 years into Genshin Impact. Then again, it feels like a lot has happened and nothing has happened at the same time since 2020. I say that because gacha games are notorious for advancing their power scaling at breakneck paces, making it extremely improbable for units to stay relevant for more than a year at best. With this game's conservative approach to power creep, even if we include version 4's roster, dozens of characters have maintained their positions throughout the meta practically since the day they came out, allowing players to continue enjoying their favorite units without worrying about how strong they are. Although I feel like that would still be the case even if their mains fell off. Units typically extend their tenure through synergy, such as if a new character comes out who can either support their playstyle or vice versa, the unit can support the new character's playstyle. The most resilient ones are naturally supports and sub-DPS units, as they could be used in a wide variety of team compositions without being intrusive. Whereas for main DPS characters, everything has to start and end with them, constraining their deployment value to what they themselves could bring to the table. Hence why most of the units that fell off quote-unquote are main DPS units, superseded by whatever new shiny damage dealers come out thereafter. Several members of the cast have been given a second lease on life, either preserving their viability in a usable state or even rocketing all the way to the top. But there's one character in Genshin's history who frankly should have fallen off long ago, but has gotten so many second chances that you wonder if the irony was intentional given her occupation. Today we'll be going through the long storied history of Hu Tao, the character who refuses to die. Hu Tao was, and still is, one of Genshin's most beloved characters, from the extreme anticipation people had for her debut back in early 2021 to her continuous usage even by endgame players. She's gone through more changes and adaptations than arguably any other main DPS character in the game, having monopolized the title of the strongest pyro attacker in the game, that is, unless you regard Xiangling as one. And while after 3.5 long years, her title has finally been relinquished to Arlecchino following the latter's release not too long ago, Hu Tao is still widely considered a top-tier attacker, especially when you account for ease of use. When she first came out, many were quick to notice the sheer disparity in power between her and the running pyro champion at the time, Diluc. Hu Tao's ability to catapult her attack stat past what anyone could come close to on their own was a major contributing factor to that, along with a significantly faster rate of attack owing to being a polearm user. While you could argue Diluc still won in terms of area coverage and the privilege of breaking material shields, Hu Tao firmly established herself as a top runner from the get-go and rounded out the Liyue trio. Taking into account the scarcity of practical 5-star attackers back in the day, she held a special place in many people's hearts, likely being one of the first damage dealers most players actually invested a lot of time and resources into. I think a lot of that had to do with the fact that so much attention was given to her initial release, both the character and her personal weapon, the Staff of Homa, affectionately referred to as the Staff of Homeless. The stats on this weapon were pretty much a dead giveaway for who it was intended for. We had signature weapons made for previous units, but this was the first high-profile instance of a weapon being so obviously made for the accompanying unit, and Hu Tao utilized it very well thanks to her own penchant for wanting to stay below a certain amount of health. She was a perfect combination of damage and durability, having a playstyle enjoyed by many to this very day. Funnily enough though, version 1 was arguably her worst time period relative to the rest of her career. Though she had Xingqiu accompanying her, there weren't that many cast members who could synergize with her all that well since, as you know, Bennett's attack boost, while usable, isn't that measurable on a character who already has over like 3000 attack to begin with, not to mention constant regeneration being counterproductive to her desire to keep one foot in the grave. For most endgame players, she ran double Geo back in the day, using Albedo mostly for filler purposes if nothing else. Fortunately for her, the prevailing mentality of version 1 mostly consisted of playing who you enjoyed, with theory crafting and party optimization still being a niche practice at the time. Overall, Hu Tao had a modest start objectively speaking, but relatively, she was stationed around the top of the pecking order simply because of the absence of any real competition. Things got a bit more challenging for her entering version 2. Multiple damage dealers got released back-to-back from the get-go. Ayaka, Yoimiya, Raiden Shogun, and Ito coming out pretty much one after another. While you can debate their actual placements in relation to Hu Tao, the increased number of on-field attackers bloated the pool of candidates to choose from, especially since a number of them had strong and accessible teams to work with. Not just those who came after, Hu Tao had to contend with their old rivals too. Around this time, Child's international team began to gain traction, with Kazuha taking the final position of the squad, and Child finally receiving a proper weapon to make use of. Not just that, but even more budget-friendly teams like Sucro's Taser grew in popularity, and with Hu Tao's best team at the time requiring no less than 3 5-star characters, plus ideally the Staff of Homa attached to her, early version 2 was quite a hurdle to say the least. Even so, by this point she was the most invested character for most people, and with her showing little signs of difficulty in clearing the game's content, those who built her up still kept using her, and she still had no trouble abusing Vaporize for massive amounts of damage. Even after the Pyro roster received another 5-star in the form of Yoimiya, Hu Tao had no issue holding the line as the best Pyro on-fielder in the game. It seems as if Hoyo wanted to keep it that way. Towards the tail end of 2022, we received Yelan during the early summer, coinciding with a version 2.7 update, and with it, the Double Hydro team was born. one of the few brute force teams in the game who kept up with the ever-steady rise of the reaction meta. Yelan's addition was crucial to the Wangshan director's survival, with Dendro looming over the horizon. With her in tandem with Xingqiu, the two could apply so much hydro to enemies that Hu Tao could achieve Vaporize on virtually every single application. And with her being the only 5-star melee pyro attacker that wasn't a claymore user, she could unleash a storm of hydro follow-up attacks, all empowering her own. Completing the double hydro team was Zhongli, whose massive shield eliminated all concerns for survival even with Hu Tao being in constant critical condition. You had a squad with some of the highest single target pressure in the game, capable of decimating any boss through a combination of pyro and hydro. Now you could argue whether or not the real stars of the show were Xingqiu and Yelan, but the fact remains, of all the pyro main DPSers, and there were a lot of them even back then, Hu Tao was still the best one by leaps and bounds at this stage of the game. So basically she held strong even with the rise of new powerhouses like Ayaka, Shogun, Ito, and with the retroactive buffs to Child. But then she got even stronger following Yelan's release, so as I mentioned would be essential for Hu Tao's longevity entering version 3. The influence Dendro had on the game may have primarily been known more for being the turning point that brought Electro from one of the worst elements in the game to one of the best, but I also think it's important to look at how it affected those who didn't synergize with the element all that well. As covered extensively in my What Happened to episodes on Ganyu and Ayaka, Pyro and Cryo, previously the two most dominant elements in the game due in no small part to Vaporize and Freeze respectively, took a massive hit in market share throughout late 2022 and most of 2023. Pyro's straightforwardness and overemphasis on power caused it to struggle against the growing damage floor of reaction teams, fracturing the roster into two groups. Those with either enough party versatility or raw strength could weather the storm, while just about everyone else lost almost all meta relevance barring extreme edge cases. Pyro stocks continued declining in value after the catastrophic failure that was Dia, a 5-star character intended to be a main DPS quick swap attacker, the first of her kind. With how terribly designed her kit was, she was relegated to being a niche, and I heavily emphasize niche support. Subsequently though, it further exacerbated the obvious problem that Pyro was suffering from, its inability to adapt to changes in the meta. Granted, Bennett and Shenling were doing just fine courtesy of the vast number of parties they could be used in. Along with them, however, was our chipper little coffin saleswoman, Hu Tao. How did she end up on the rich get richer side while the rest of Pyro's many DPS units were made to suffer? It all goes back to double hydro. Were it not for Yelan, Hu Tao most certainly would have crumbled under the might of Dendro. Thanks to double hydro, however, she held on through sheer force. Literally. Even with the release of more and more top tiers like Alhaita, Nahida, and Nilu, the simplicity of Hu Tao's gameplay and that of her teammates made her a comfortable and still strong option for players to choose, especially since you could use her while still having plenty of units for the other Abyss party. Kokomi, for example, could take care of any Hyper Bloom needs, or you could ignore the need for Hydro altogether with Aggravate. And of course, with her not requiring Bennett whatsoever, you could still use him on the other side for a Child International and whatnot. Hu Tao was still the only melee fast attack speed Pyro on field during the game. Tia, Gli, Yoimiya, Dilu, Yanfei, etc. were all bow, claymore, or catalyst uses. To this very day, Bennett is the only Pyro sword character in the game. That's how lopsided the weapon distribution was for Pyro. Hu Tao was really the only viable brute force team in the game throughout version 3. I say brute force, she still uses a reaction in the form of Vaporize, but most people don't consider Vaporize and Melt, the two amplifying reactions, to be actual reactions like transformative or additive ones, in light of the damage being directly based on the triggering attack's power. But for all intents and purposes, the issues of the Pyro element were clear. It was dependent solely on power for better or worse. Hu Tao happened to have just enough power to get by, but as you know, power would soon creep come version 4, and she would face her greatest challenge in competition yet. One of the first units released in Fontaine was Linny, yet another Pyro bow user, but unlike the others, he was actually good. So good in fact, that individually speaking, he may be one of the strongest damage dealers in the game. For the first time ever, we finally had a match for Hu Tao. Thing is, however, Linny went a completely different direction from Hu Tao in regards to team building, as he makes use of Mono Pyro instead of Vaporize. Theoretically, you could have both characters' best in slot teams in the same Spiral Abyss run, with Hu Tao taking Xingqiu, Yelan, and Zhongli, while Linny took Bennett, Shanling, and Kosuha. So in all actuality, Linny was of zero concern for Hu Tao, as they share not a single character, unless you're a little bitch and use Zhongli for Linny. No, I'm just kidding, I do the same. Come version 4, the team building meta became very comprehensive, with there being so many potential teams to work with. Now thanks to Genshin having barely anything to do, the game still came a long way in regards to the number of teams you can play. The next challenge was of course Novelette, who, while not a Pyro character, pretty much set the new standard for on-field damage, raising the bar to new heights. Though he's inarguably the best user of Farina, Hu Tao managed to squeeze her way into the list, being another character who also made fantastic use of her. With this came the newly refurbished Double Hydra Team 2.0, replacing Xingqiu and Zhongli with Farina and Jin. Not only did Furina supply enough damage augmentation to where Hu Tao could intentionally forgo her own low health boost, but she also opened up the possibility of her teams gaining access to VV Shred, something Hu Tao struggled to incorporate before. To be clear, you're mostly VV shredding Hydro, not Pyro, but it's still her team. With said team, Hu Tao once again survived another advancement in Genshin's power scaling, still keeping a leg up on the competition. While double Hydro with Furina was much riskier since you no longer had super armor and protection from burst damage, the trade-off in power was unbelievable, more so towards higher levels of investment. Constellations on her, Yelan, and Furina would make her one of the best vertical investment teams in the game. Not only that, but with the Furina party, you could potentially swap out Staff of Homa for Scarlet Sands and go for a more elemental mastery focused build for even greater vaporized damage. Early on, I brought up that Pyro and by extension its characters had a hard time adapting because of how straightforward the element was, leaving not much room for Pyro to go for more supportive or team-oriented strategies, at least before Shevers came out. Hu Tao was surprisingly resourceful for her Pyro on-fielder, capitalizing on opportunities to stay relevant wherever and whenever she found them. Nothing underscores this more than the advent of Xianyun. What Xianyun brought to the game was an interesting way of looking at on-field attackers, enabling virtually everyone to try out plunging attacks. The greatest beneficiaries of her were obviously Xiao and Diluc, the former's entire identity revolving around the mechanic in question, and the latter having the highest plunging attack scaling in the game. While these two saw the most gain from Cloud Retainer, Hu Tao wasn't that far behind, especially thanks to already having the other three pieces of the puzzle. In addition to Xianyun being a plunging attack enabler, she also provides the team with a full party heal, letting you substitute Jean with her. Pogo Stick Hu Tao would just two things: 1, her somewhat poor area coverage, and 2, her stamina cost. If you had C1, stamina wasn't the biggest issue out there, but with plunging attacks consuming no stamina, there really wasn't that big a difference between C0 and C1 Hu Tao anymore. The damage is absolutely exquisite. By virtue of this unique playstyle, Hu Tao is still a potential candidate for the top 5 best DPSers in the game, which I talked about briefly in my video on the subject a couple weeks ago. It's incredible, every single time Genshin has pushed a ceiling on strength, Hu Tao climbed higher as well. With every major shift in the meta, she found a way to stay relevant. Arlecchino would be the first time that Hu Tao finally met her match, as now we not only have another Pyro on-field polearm user, but someone who more or less can use the same double Hydro strategy that she can. I personally consider Arlecchino to be stronger than Hu Tao, and possibly the strongest DPS unit in the entire game period if we go by the absolute limits of a character, but it doesn't change how impressive it is that Hu Tao, a version 1 character, is still in contention for top 5. For someone who spends her time selling pre-orders for coffins to people and her morbid innuendos, she's stubbornly resilient. Even if, with the release of Natlan, we finally get more Pyro units who are superior to her, the fact that she held on for this long, longer than arguably anyone else of her kind, is why I wanted to make this video. Countless units have changed a great deal over time, but whenever I try to picture the unit who adapted the most, it always ends up being her. More than Shao, more than Shogun, more than Kokomi. For better or worse, things are going to change for Genshin as we approach version 5, with Arlecchino having taken the mantle as the best Pyro attacker in the game, and with the Pyro Archon coming very soon. More likely than not, this will be Hu Tao's last hurrah, and I gotta say, it was a very successful career. You can think of this video as me paying homage to her, if you will. I think she more than pulled her weight. Or who knows, maybe this girl will somehow find a way to cling on to life through version 5, version 6, and so on. Then maybe she really will be the character who just refuses to die. What are your thoughts on Hu Tao? Do you think she has it in her to last another year, or do you think this is her farewell season? Let me know in the comments down below. If you enjoyed the video, a like and subscribe would be very much appreciated. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter at Vars, join my Discord server, and even though I chose a different title for this video, I recommend you check out my What Happened To series if you haven't yet. It's kind of the same basic vibe. But till next time, thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.